Welcome to this webinar for Level 3 Diploma in Teaching Yoga students. You should be able to write a 5-week session plan for a mixed ability class of approximately 1 hour. This is the class that you will be planning and practicing teaching on your course, that is a mixed ability Hatha Yoga class, and it comprises of 3 main elements. Again, you'll go through these on course with your tutor. It comprises of the opening phase, the main phase, and the ending and closing phase. You'll then also learn how to modify and progress your session plans for weeks 1 and weeks 10, producing a 10-week progressive programme, and this all meets the requirements for your assessment elements, which are assessment elements 8 and 9. Here you can see the criteria checklist for your session plans or assessment element 8. Please refer to the checklist whilst completing your session plans and before submitting your session plans. Your tutor will also offer you guidance during your course. Your session plans are part of your assessment element 8, and they're plans of the course that you're going to be teaching throughout your course and teaching as part of your assessment at the end. So these are the lesson plans that accompany that. And that class is an hour mixed ability Hatha Yoga class. And the session plans comprise of the following elements as discussed in the previous slide. The opening phase, the first phase, which contains the initial relaxation, mobilization or warming up the body, and sun salutations. And then the main phase comprises of 5 yoga postures or asana. And the ending and closing, the last part of the class, contains the relaxation and pranayama or breathing exercises and whatever ending and closing you want to add to that. The session plan mentioned in the previous slide is described in a little bit more detail over the next few slides. So you'll see that we call this page the header page, and you'll see spaces at the top for you to write your name and sign and date, and for the assessor to do the same. So the day you produce your plans is the date that you write on them. And then below that, each of the 4 columns on your session plans has been colour coded so that I can explain it to you in a little bit more detail over the next few slides. So now we look at the first column in your session plan. So the first heading you'll see here in yellow asks you to write what week it is. So if it's week 5, you'd put 5 next to it, or the same for 1, or the same for 10. Ask you to draw the diagram, name the asana, the counter pose, and the breaths. So underneath, you'll see an image of somebody doing a seated forward bend. So where it asks for the asana, for an image of the asana, to draw the diagram, you either draw the asana or insert a diagram of the posture here, and underneath, write the name of the posture and write the amount of breaths, or whether you're breathing in or whether you're breathing out. As this is a mobility, we're not really staying in a posture for a long period of time, so we just remain here for about a breath. Ask them for the counter or the posture that moves in the opposite direction. Your tutor will go through this with you a little bit more on course, so you have a better understanding. But it's generally the next posture that you're going to do. So again, there's an image here of a seated spinal extension, and I've written the name of what the posture is, and again the breath, whether I'm breathing in or whether I'm breathing out, and if I'm staying in it for an amount of time or amount of breaths. Now we look at the second column, and you see here in blue it asks for the phase, and next to that, if it's the opening phase, you'd write opening next to it. If it's the main, you'd write main, and if it's ending and closing, you'd write ending and closing. It asks for the purpose or the reason, the benefits, and then for the teaching points. So underneath you'll see the purpose or the reason for doing that exercise or group of exercises is to mobilise the spine and hips. We're referring to the postures we talked about in column 1. And then the main teaching points. We want at least 4 teaching points, and if it's a seated posture, then we start from the foundation part or the lowest part, so the feet or the sitting bones. So cross ankles, sit tall and inhale, and you list a few teaching points here. The session plan template can be found in Word format in the resources section of your Microsoft Teams.
You'll produce one document for all weeks 1, 5 and 10. Once this is completed, it can be uploaded to the Microsoft Teams ready for assessment.
So in this slide, we'll talk about the third column in your session plan. You'll see the heading indicated in green. So in this column, we need to write a progression, an adaptation and a visualization for the posture we referred to in the first column. So my progression would be to bring the elbows to the floor. Adaptation or a modification would be to have the legs straight. If you remember, in the posture, the ankles were crossed, and then the visualization would be to feel the length in your spine. So in your main phase asana, you'll be asked to add 3 progressions for each of those 5 asana. In your opening phase, we only need 1 progression, and also the same for the closing, but that's talked about a little bit more when we get to those particular slides. And then we think about an adaptation. So how can you adapt the posture for somebody who may be less able? As you see here, I've written legs straight. And what visualization can you use for the posture, providing a mental image that helps particularly auditory learners understand a little bit more about what you want them to feel like in a particular posture. So now we look at the 4th column and what we need to write in the 4th column. So in the 4th column, it's asking for precautions, any equipment that you might use, and whether you're demonstrating or guiding the posture. So here it's asking for the precaution for the adaptation. So if you think back to your previous slide and the 3rd column, in the 3rd column it was asking for an adaptation to the posture. And the posture is this cross-legged forward flexion. And as an adaptation, we wrote that the legs would be straight. So we think about that as the how. So when it asks for the precaution in the 4th column, that's really the why. You know, why are we saying to somebody, instead of having your ankles crossed, you can have your legs straight? What sort of people might need to do that? So the P in the 4th column has a relationship with the A in the 3rd. So we'd say to somebody, if you can't cross your ankles, have your legs extended. If you have, for instance, say, knee issues. Then it's also asking for what equipment you might use, and you indicate that by writing a capital E, and next to it, what equipment you'd use there, whether it's a block, a blanket, a strap, for example. And it's asking, are you demonstrating or guiding that particular posture, or is it a mixture of both? So a demonstration would be you saying to your students, watch me while I show you how to do this. And a guide would be you sitting and just telling them what to do without showing it to them physically. So most of what you're going to write in your plans is going to be a mixture of you demonstrating and guiding. You just need to indicate this in that 4th column. So here we have an example of a completed or part of a completed opening phase session plan. So you have your 4 columns here that we've filled in, the 4 headings that we've just gone through. So this enables you to see what part of a finished lesson plan would look like. So again, in the 1st column here, we've drawn the diagram, we've named the asana, and if it has a counter posture, it's not always necessarily going to have a counter posture. The amount of time, so I've done that here for 2 postures. The 2nd column, again, we've written that it's an opening phase, purpose, the benefits, and the teaching points are listed. And in the 3rd column, we have listed if there is to be a progression, an adaptation, and a visualization. And they would be listed down here in this 3rd column. And a precaution, equipment, and demonstrating a guide all comes down into this 4th column.
You also need to include in your opening phase session planning for sun salutation or Surya Namaskar. So you'll need to include in this session planning how many rounds of sun salutation you will be teaching for each of the weeks 1, 5 and 10. You can add at the very, very top of the plan for sun salutations the benefits or the purpose for the sequence as a whole, as an introduction to the sun salutations that you can then use when you're actually teaching this practice. You may also wish to add brief benefits to each of the 9 to 12 postures you're teaching and the order of the sequence you're teaching them in. Aim for 5 to 6 teaching points per asana or posture, and aim to have at least one adaptation and precaution for each posture or exercise. This would be in the third column. Add visualizations if you feel that they're relevant, and also add in the fourth column if you're demonstrating only or guiding or both, and are you using any equipment. And you'll also need to identify any precautions in that fourth column also.
In the same way you created your plan for the initial relaxation, you'll use the same template for your sun salutation. As we explained in a little bit more detail in the previous slide, that there's a little bit of different information that needs to be put into this particular lesson plan. If you can see in the first column, you need to indicate how many rounds of sun salutation you're going to do. So this is for week 5 here. So when you come to your week 10 session plan, those rounds will increase to show that you've understood how to progress. And then also for week 1, the number of rounds would have reduced. Then you can understand how to adapt and modify. And your tutor will assist you and guide you on producing plans for week 1, 5 and 10. And throughout course you'll learn how to progress and how to adapt depending on whether you're working with somebody week 1 who's a complete beginner or somebody who's at week 10 level and is a bit more advanced. And you can do that by adding progressions in your third column to show more challenging versions of postures, adaptations in your third column to show more modified versions of postures.
When completing your session plans for week 1, 5 and 10, in the first column you need to add the name of the asana, add an image of the asana that you're using and what it looks like at that particular week. If you can't find an image that best reflects what the asana looks like at that week, add an image that looks similar, and then underneath write in bullet points what the asana looks like. You can then add more detail when you write the teaching points in the second column. You also need to add the counter pose. So if it's a posture that's done on 2 sides, like the example of Vrikshasana or tree or triangle, for example, you just write underneath that you do the counter pose on the other side. If you do an asana that requires a different counter pose, a different posture, so say for example you're doing bridge pose, your counter pose would be something like Apanasana, wind relieving pose. You would need to name that asana, add an image of the asana, and write how many breaths you would be holding the counter pose for. And that's generally half of the amount of breaths of the form. Aim to add at least 5 to 6 teaching points for each asana in the second column. We also need to see at least one adaptation and one precaution for each asana in the third and fourth columns. It is a requirement that we see at least 3 progressions for each of the 5 asana. Again, that can be added in the third column. We also want to see 1 visualization for each asana, again in the third column, and at least 2 pieces of equipment or props. But this is across the whole of the class, so you could use a yoga block, a rolled up blanket, for example, a chair. And then finally, are you guiding or demonstrating or both? And that's indicated in the fourth column.
So by now you should be much more familiar with creating these plans, and on course you will have been practicing teaching your class and also practicing session plan writing with your tutor. So now we look at the ending and closing phase session plan. It's the last part of the class where you teach your guided relaxation and your pranayama. Again, you're planning for this as well. So you'll see in the first column an image of Shavasana and just indicate how long you're going to be in Shavasana in minutes. And below it the same with your pranayama. with your pranayama indicate whether it's going to be just one breath or one round of breath. And again, your tutor would advise you on this as you continue through your course. If you want to add closing chants, or if you want to add a prayer or a poem at the end, you can indicate that. You notice in your second column, you'd write that it's your ending and closing. And then as before, the purpose and the teaching points are written down there. Now, when you come to your third column, again, we need you to add at least one progression and one adaptation and one visualization for your initial relaxation and for your pranayama. And again, those are indicated as we have done previously with an A, a P and a V. And in the final column, again, you need to add a precaution that is relevant to the adaptation. If there's any equipment you're going to be using, and are you going to be guiding it or are you going to be demonstrating it? Once you've completed your week 5 session plans, you will then look at producing session plans for week 1 and also for week 10. So we're just going to look at adapting the session plans for week 1. So we think now about these week 1 participants who may be completely new to yoga or have very limited experience in yoga. So how can we adapt the session plan we wrote at week 5 to suit those people at week 1? So what considerations for modifying the postures for beginners to yoga in week 1? So we can modify the posture, as you can see from the image here of Vrikshasana or tree pose. The foot is closer to the ground or resting on a block or a brick, which is modifying it. We can reduce the range of movement of the joints so the hands are lower, which again is making it slightly less challenging. We can reduce the number of breaths or the amount of time spent in the posture. We can offer a simplified, so when we offer the prep pose, we could even say, let's just repeat the prep pose again. Again, once we've completed our week 5 plans, we can now look forwards at how we change our session plans for week 10 participants, those who are a little bit more able and capable. So what progressions for more advanced yoga practitioners at week 10? So the plans that we created at week 5, how can we make those more progressed, more challenging for more advanced practitioners so that they are also stretched and challenged in the class? So we can offer progressions such as increase the joint range of movement, so arms can go above the head, say. Maybe the foot can lift higher, or we can bring the feet closer together, creating a more balanced challenge. We could increase the number of breaths or time spent in a posture. Postures can stay the same for weeks 1, 5 and 10. More advanced postures can be introduced past week 10 by adding them into your third column as a progression. But again, your tutor will guide you through this on your course. Alongside your weeks 1, 5 and 10 session plans, we also have the 10-week progressive program to complete for your assessment. So if we think about our weeks 1, 5 and 10 session plans as a very detailed plan of what your class will look like at a particular point. The progressive plan is really a snapshot of those plans. So you would be able to look at it and quite clearly see how a posture or group of postures is progressed from weeks 1 to 10. If we think about the main body of our session plans as the news, the main news, the article in a newspaper, if you like. Think of the progressive program as the headlines. It's a very visual representation of weeks 1 to 10. So all those interim weeks, the weeks 2, 3, 4, and the weeks between 5 and 10, to get this real overview of how the session is progressed. And this is mainly depicted using images and a small amount of text to explain what the image is.
Over the next 2 slides, you'll see a partially completed 10-week progressive programme example. Start by adding the information you've written in your session plans week 1, 5 and 10, and then completing the remaining boxes by showing how you mean to progress from weeks 1 to 5 and weeks 5 to 10. In the first part, or the opening phase, you need to add an image for Shavasana, some brief text underneath with what type of breathing you'll be practicing at that week. For the mobilisation, you can choose any image that you're using for the mobilisation part of the practice, whether that's supine, seated, or all fours cat-cow, again indicating what you will be practicing at that particular week. In sun salutations, you do not need to add an image, just please write in each box how many rounds you'll be practicing at that week, whether those rounds will be full or whether those rounds will be modified. The main phase asana, you need to add the names of the asana at the very, very top and indicate the order you'll be teaching them in. You then add an image. Again, if that image doesn't best represent what the asana looks like, you can add some bullet points in text underneath, as well as adding in how many breaths you're holding it for. For the ending and closing, find an image that best represents Shavasana, and again, a few bullet points outlining what you're teaching at that particular week underneath. In the final column for the pranayama, indicate what pranayama practice you'll be teaching and add an image that best represents that, along with how many rounds you're completing. You also need to consider the seated asana your participants will be in for that pranayama. At week 1, easy seated or sukhasana is more appropriate for beginners. You might then wish to progress up to maybe half lotus, weeks 5 or 10, or siddhasana, or another seated asana of your choice.
So just to recap, in your 10-week progressive programme, you're required to include the following things. So as I showed in the previous slide, you have an image for each phase, apart from the sun salutations when you write how many rounds you're performing. So the image that you're putting needs to be representative of what the posture looks like at each week. So if the image isn't that clear about what posture looks like, then you can add a very brief description. Ensure the images aren't too big and you haven't written too much description, as the progressive programme is on 2 sheets of paper and it doesn't really want to be on any more than 2 sheets of paper. So you write how many breaths you've planned, again just for the full pose, and the order in which the asanas are to be performed. An image to represent your closing, relaxation, what that looks like, and the amount of breaths or the breath ratio for your pranayama. And again, your tutor will guide you through all of this on course.
The assessment criteria for Assessment Element 9 can be found on Microsoft Teams. Assessment Element 9 is for your 10-week progressive programme and Viva. Once you've completed and uploaded your 10-week progressive programme, your assessor will contact you to schedule and complete the Viva. A template for your 10-week progressive programme can be found on Microsoft Teams. Before submitting your work, check you have met all the assessment criteria as mentioned in the earlier slides. Once completed, please upload to Microsoft Teams for assessment.
Your course tutor is there to guide you and give you feedback throughout your course. They're there to help you stay on top of homework and complete your work in a timely manner. It's important to stay on top of your work, so try to stay as close to the deadlines as you can, so that all of your work is completed and handed in at the correct time for you to be able to complete your course.
You can find images to use on your session plans. There are many different platforms, including Tummy, where you can find images that best depict the asana or exercises you're using. Ensure the images are not too large and there is enough space for you to add the text you need to add. Once the session plans are completed for weeks 1, 5 and 10, you can then copy that information across to your 10-week progressive programme. For example, how many rounds of sun salutation you're doing at week 5, at week 1 and 10 can go straight into those boxes in your 10-week progressive programme. Also, what your asana looks like at week 1, 5 and 10, the full version of that asana, that image and the amount of breaths can then be added to your 10-week progressive programme at weeks 1, 5 and 10. You're then required to show progression for the interim weeks 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8 and 9. Think of your session plans like a script for the class that you'll be teaching. The information that's in your session plans you'll be using to teach your class for your assessment, whether that's face-to-face or whether you're submitting your assessment via a video assessment. We hope this information has been useful in the completion of your session plans and 10-week progressive programme. You can watch this webinar as many times as you like to help you successfully complete your session plans. Thank you.
So now we move on to the main phase session plan. So on course you will plan and teach and practice teaching 5 main phase asana. And again, we have to plan for those using the same sheets as we've done in previous slides. And we're more or less filling them in the same way, but there's just some slightly different information that we need to understand. So down in the first column, you'll notice I have written my first of my 5 asana as tree pose. I've written it in English and Sanskrit. So each of the 5 main phase asana, we're going to teach them twice. So the first time we teach, we call it the prep pose, and that is a slightly modified version of the fuller posture. And it's held for approximately half the amount of breaths as the full pose. So if you can see my image here for Vrikshasana tree pose, the prep, the foot is low and the hands are at the heart. The second image is of the full pose, and that's of 5 breaths, and the arms are above the head and the leg is higher. So this allows participants to get into the posture at a slightly more modified way, so the body gets used to it, and therefore if they have any issues they can stay in the modified, or if they want to progress it, you can simply progress it next time you teach it. Then also we indicate the counter pose underneath, so if it's a posture that's on one side of the body, then generally the counter is the other side. You need to write the other side. If it's a completely different posture, you would need to insert an image, the amount of breaths and the name of the posture. But again, your tutor will guide you throughout course. In the second column, again, teaching points and purpose are there. So write at least 4 teaching points that refer just to the prep, just to get your students into the prep. And then rather than writing all that information out again, you'll just write from the prep pose now, and you then add another at least 4 teaching points that gets participants from the prep into the fuller version of the posture. In the third column, for each of your 5 asana, we require that you add 1 adaptation, 1 visualization, and 3 progressions per asana, per main phase asana. And then in the fourth column, we also require that you add a precaution that has a relationship with the adaptation, as we've spoken about before, that you add any equipment that's going to be used, and also you indicate whether you're demonstrating or guiding the posture. So we require that you include at least 2 pieces of equipment for each of the asana you're going to be teaching.